One miracle after another. The Pavel Goya story. Chapter 12. Many. The very next morning, Pavel couldn't help smiling as he went out to load his new car with evangelistic materials. The spacious car they had received from the kind woman in Germany couldn't have come at a more perfect time. As the beams of the morning sunlight sparkled across the car's shiny new paint, they looked like sunbeams from heaven. The joy he experienced from the dazzling sunbeams was quickly eclipsed by a dark shadow hanging over his churches. A major hindrance had been obstructing church growth for years, and unless a major change took place, they would never grow and move forward with God's blessing. The main thing holding his churches back were the church members themselves. It was unfortunate for Pavel, but his congregations were made up of people. Though many of them had been church members for years, they were still filled with pride and jealousy. Desiring to have the highest position in church office was not an exclusive problem to the disciples. His members were also doing all in their power to obtain the highest position. Each of the church elders was sure that his standing with God was far superior to that of the other elders. Consequently, each elder considered himself the only logical choice as the head elder. When one of the others was chosen, the rest of them went behind his back, attempting to discredit his leadership. And so it went with each of the church offices. Unfortunately, the prideful spirit established by the leaders set a tone of contention for the rest of the members. Often, members engaged in lengthy sessions debating the order of service. One was sure it was more appropriate to call for the offering before the morning prayer, while the one offering the prayer thought the prayer should come first, indignant at the spiritual immaturity evidenced by not realizing that his prayer was most important. After exclaiming the spirituality of their fellow church members, many were confident that they alone were being sanctified. Other than the people, Pavel's job as pastor was really not all that difficult. Pavel decided that God would never bring hurting people from the outside to join his unconverted congregation. Realizing the magnitude of the problem, he knew it would be humanly impossible to bring about unity and harmony. However, he did know what could effect the change. They needed to visit the upper room. With Pavel's encouragement, they began to meet at each other's homes for seasons of prayer. Kneeling together, they began to realize the true condition of their hearts. As their spiritual eyes were opened, they saw only filthy rags in place of their supposed righteousness. The change of spirit they experienced in their small groups motivated them to come together to pray as a church. As a body of believers, they entreated the healing power of the Holy Spirit to rule supreme in their personal lives as a blessing to the church. Joyfully, the members experienced the love and unity of meeting together as a church in the upper room. As a unified body, they now set out to share the gospel. Within 2 years, their church membership had doubled. By working with united efforts, they added a new congregation to the district. Energized by the experience, they went into neighboring communities, starting 2 additional companies of believers. Praying together had truly effected a positive change. Many of the youth and young adults had become disenchanted with their parents' religion. The kind of Christianity they had observed did not appeal to them, and rather than pretend that all was well, they simply quit attending church altogether. Pavel made it a special point to seek out the missing youth, inviting them to come on camping trips and other outings. After being personally invited, several hesitantly agreed. When Pavel shared his personal experiences around the campfire and began organizing them in small groups for prayer and discussion, many of them experienced God's presence for the first time. It was not unusual for the phone to ring constantly for a couple of days after a camping trip. Parents wanted to know what Pavel had done to their teenagers. They're acting so different. They're now praying and reading their Bibles. Pavel would often respond, "I didn't do anything, but God did." The Sabbath following a campout usually brought young worshippers back to church as enthusiastic participants. Every time a young person who had been missing for some time came back to the church, it became a celebration. Their youthful energy warmed the church in a way nothing else could. Both young and old were thrilled with how well the church was doing. The government, however, was not doing any better. If it had changed at all, it was for the worse. With the economy really struggling, many of the church members were all too familiar with hunger. There just wasn't enough of anything to go around. Each day was a new test of faith and trust in God. The shortages included gas for their cars. Long lines around gas stations had become a way of life. Those who wanted to drive would have to wait in line as long as it took. There was no escaping it. Sometimes it meant sleeping in the car for a day or two in the line. Once a car finally reached the pump, 10 gallons was all that could be purchased for the entire month. Gas was so precious that drivers advanced their cars in the waiting line by pushing them rather than wasting the fuel to start them. With an appointment the following day, Pavel knew he would have to make a trip to the gas station just outside of Hotelu Rosu. He could only hope the line wouldn't be more than a day long. Just as he passed the city limit sign, he came to a long line of creeping cars. A horse pulling a wagon loaded with firewood plodded along, setting the pace. The winding 2-lane country road had precious few places straight enough for passing, and the line of cars continued to lengthen behind the horse. As the horse and wagon slowly rounded a bend, a straight stretch of road opened up, providing the weary drivers a long-awaited opportunity to pass. When Pavel reached the wagon, he edged to the center of the road in order to get a clear view of oncoming traffic. 2 cars and a large truck loaded with construction materials were approaching, but they were still far enough away to ensure safe passing. Taking advantage of the opening, he quickly passed the wagon, accelerating back to normal speed. He was still gaining speed when he met the oncoming traffic. The 2 cars passed by without incident. However, when the back bumper of the large truck was even with Pavel's car, a teenage boy, who had apparently been waiting to cross the road, ran out in front of him. With his foot still moving to the brake pedal, Pavel watched in horror as the left side of his car struck the boy's hip and leg. He stared out the windshield in disbelief as the impact threw the boy into the air, directly into the path of his car. Desperately trying to avoid hitting the boy for a second time, Pavel slammed down the brakes and jerked the steering wheel to the left. His screeching tires skidded to the center of the road. Each second felt like an eternity. The sickening in his stomach intensified as he watched the boy's limp body drop in front of the passenger side of his car. It was impossible to avoid him. With a loud thud, The right side of his car impacted the boy's head and shoulder, causing him to fly into the air a second time. In anguish, he watched as his limp form came down, bouncing along the shoulder of the road. If only this were a nightmare. Skidding to a stop, Pavel jumped from his car and raced back to the motionless body at the side of the road. He feared the worst as he bent over the crumpled form, with blood running from his ears, nose, eyes, and mouth. It was quite clear he was unconscious, but at least he was still breathing. Maybe, just maybe, there was a chance he would live. Pavel felt himself go numb from shock as he looked on in helplessness at the dying boy. The teenager was known as Mene Mene, so nicknamed because of his severe stuttering problem. Disabled and mentally delayed, he was well known by everyone in the area. He traveled all over town, hobbling up and down and sideways all at the same time. He had almost no control of his arms, causing them to flail randomly. He had never been able to play with other kids, and now, though he was 19, it was impossible for him to work. Unable to do anything else, he went around begging, hoping for enough money to buy food. This was not his first time to dart into traffic. He had escaped his previous accidents with minor injuries, but this time, his battered body hadn't fared so well. Another motorist, observing the accident, stopped to see if he could help. One quick glance said it all. The boy's only chance of survival was an immediate trip to the hospital. With the help of others who had stopped to help, Mene Mene was loaded into the back seat of a nearby vehicle. Thankfully, the hospital in Otello Russo was only a short distance away, and within a few minutes, the driver transported him to the emergency room. After a brief examination, he was transported by ambulance to a larger hospital in Karansabes, better equipped for trauma patients. Seeing his condition, hospital staff flew into action, administering oxygen and an IV. Then he was rushed to the X-ray department. Several doctors and nurses gathered as the X-rays were attached to the view box for reading. His injuries were so extensive that there wasn't anything that could be done. His brain was hemorrhaging profusely. His spine was fractured in 2 places. He had a broken hip, arm, and leg, and one lung was severely punctured, explaining the gurgling sounds coming from his mouth. Without warning, the pulsing beeps of the heart monitor abruptly changed to a haunting, steady tone. With no blood pressure, his life had ended. Resuscitation was not attempted. He was covered with a sheet until he could be transferred to the morgue. One by one, the doctors and nurses filed from the room. They had done all they could. It just wasn't enough. Pavel remained alone in the room with the motionless figure under the sheet. Kneeling by the side of the bed, he began to pray. God, what are the people in Otello Rosso going to say when they hear that I killed a young man just beginning his life? They know I'm a pastor. What will they think? If need be, I'm willing to exchange my life for his. I know you are able to bring him back to life if you choose. I'm asking you, please, bring him back. Please, God. Please. As Pavel was pleading with God, one of the doctors came back into the room. Seeing Pavel kneeling beside the bed, he said, "Pastor, he's dead. Can't you see it's too late for you to pray now? You should have thought of praying while he was still alive. Just go home. We're taking him down to the morgue." Do you think I'm praying to someone with human limitations? I'm talking to God. He is the God of miracles. Nothing is impossible for him. In the Bible, he raised several people from the dead, Pavel reminded the doctor. I know about those stories, but that was back then. Times have changed. I'm afraid I have bad news for you, Pastor. Since neither of us has seen any dead people walking around lately, you might as well go home. It wasn't your fault, and there was nothing you could have done to avoid it. Just face it. It's over. Ending his consolation, the doctor turned and walked away with Pavel still kneeling beside the bed. After the doctor left the room, Pavel got up from his knees and made his way to the door. Silently praying, he glanced one last time at the lifeless form of the boy under the sheet. At home, it was impossible for him to sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, the accident flashed before him. With eyes red and swollen, he and Dana cried out to God hour after hour for strength. They were exhausted, but sleep would not come. As they prayed, they realized, thankfully, that they were not suffering alone. They could feel God's presence as the comforter as he whispered, "My grace is sufficient for you." 2 Corinthians chapter 12 and verse 9. Just that morning, they had read the words of that verse. They certainly needed his grace at that moment. All night, he and Dana continued their tear-stained prayers. Together they pleaded, "Dear God, we aren't trying to tell you what you should do, but we know you are able to restore life. You're the one who created it in the beginning. And Lord, if there's any way you can use restoring this young man's life for your honor and glory, please do it. If you choose not to restore him, we will learn to live with it, even though it won't be easy. Whatever you see best, we will accept it." As hard as it was, they prayed, "Thy will be done." The next morning, Pavel returned to the hospital, hoping to speak to Mene's family. Opening the door to the young victim's room, he found him sitting up in bed, eating. As Pavel's shock turned to pure joy, he saw that he was not the only one to be surprised. A host of doctors, nurses, specialists, and hospital administrators were crowded into Mene's room, comparing the two sets of x-rays. On the left were the x-rays from the day before. On the right was a new set. Standing behind the medical staff, Pavel listened to their baffled observations. The x-ray from yesterday clearly shows massive brain hemorrhaging, but the one from today shows absolutely none. It is easy to see on this first x-ray that the spine is broken in two places. But look at this one. His spine is absolutely perfect. And look at the lungs. We all heard him struggling to breathe with his lungs full of blood. Now look at them. the doctor said, pointing to the x-rays. They're normal and healthy. And look at his shoulder and hip over here. They're not just green stick fractures, they're completely shattered. But once again, they're in perfect condition in this new set of x-rays. The only x-rays comparable are for his arm and leg. They appear to be the same in both. We'll have to put them in casts, but other than that, he appears to be in perfect health. Over and over, they stared at the two sets of x-rays, unable to find a reasonable explanation. None of them had ever seen anything like it. They just couldn't believe their eyes. Unless their x-ray machine was seriously defective, they just couldn't explain a patient being clearly dead the day before and being very much alive and eating his breakfast right beside them at that very moment. With every scientific explanation exhausted, a miracle prompted by the prayers of a pastor was the only option left. Silently, the doctor who had scoffed the day before pondered the reality that a dead person would soon be walking the streets. Pavel smiled as he tried to imagine the mortician arriving for work that morning. He probably had opened the door as he did every day, expecting to begin the normal routine. Perhaps he pinched himself to see if he was dreaming when he saw Mene sitting up on the table. Never before had he been greeted by a cadaver. The previous night, he distinctly remembered leaving him wrapped on a table. Now here he was, asking for breakfast. With eyes needing to be reinserted into their sockets, he had stammered into the phone for someone to come down to the morgue and take Mene back upstairs. He no longer qualified as an occupant for one of his stainless steel tables. He was breathing. Quite possibly, the mortician was considering a change in occupations at that very moment. As the medical specialist turned from looking at the x-rays and began to examine the patient himself, they were confounded by another discovery. Mene now spoke perfectly. Not a hint of stuttering could be detected in his speech. He was without a doubt their most mysterious case. The doctors put Mene's two remaining broken bones in casts and released him from the hospital. In a few weeks, he was ready for his casts to be taken off. When he was able to walk without crutches, another unexplainable phenomenon became apparent. He had a total transformation in his posture and now had perfect limb control. From that moment on, he walked as normally as anyone else. If they knew God, they wouldn't be surprised, Pavel thought to himself. Why would he restore him back to life with his previous limitations? His life would have been miserable all over again. Did they think it was harder for God to restore his limbs than to give him back his life? Shortly after Mene's accident, Pavel went to the grocery store hoping to buy a bottle of cooking oil. He wasn't really surprised when he found the shelves empty. Locating a clerk, he asked her if she knew when they would be receiving another shipment of cooking oil. Studying him for a minute, she called to the back of the store. "Sandy, the Adventist pastor is here. Do you have any cooking oil back there? If we do, you better give him a bottle. You never know, he might pray for your family." People who had never given God a thought were now beginning to have second thoughts. Word of Mene's miracle had spread to everyone in the small town. When the evangelistic meeting started a couple weeks later, the church was packed. Many of the visitors stayed after the meetings, asking for prayer. The response from the meetings was like none any of the members had ever seen before. When the series ended, the church doubled its membership by those joining through baptism. Together, the church members praised God for turning a real tragedy into transformed lives. It wasn't only Mene who had been given another chance to live. Those experiencing new spiritual lives felt incredibly blessed as well. In the Gospel of John, the resurrection and the life called Lazarus from his dusty tomb with a simple command. And from that day on, he walked the streets of Bethany as a living testimony. In very much the same way, Mene's restored life declared the life-giver's power to the people in the small town of Otelu Rosu. The spring in his step and his perfect stride was irrefutable evidences that his power is still the same today. The end of chapter 12. One miracle after another. The Pavel Goya story.